Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Mindel. I'm a psychologist in private practice in Montreal. Some of you may remember me from my presentation on Anna Freud last year. And this afternoon, I'm going to talk some more about the history of thought around daydreaming. And I'm going to reflect on psychologist Carl Jung's technique of active imagination, which is a technique that's firmly based in the idea that the characters, the dynamics, and the concerns that are represented in fantasy and dreams are not random elements, but carry personal and sometimes even universal meaning. And this, I think, connects to a deeper reason why immersive and maladaptive daydreamers become so attached to their characters and feel a sort of an instinct to keep and protect them. And if you've heard anything about Carl Jung yourself, you may not at all be surprised to learn that Carl Jung had a very strong capacity for fantasy and daydreaming himself. But before I get into the nitty-gritty of Carl Jung and his theory of active imagination, since I know from previous meetings here that we won't all be immersive daydreamers, we're just going to take a couple of minutes to do a little preliminary imagination exercise so that we're all kind of on the same page about the experience. So I'm going to ask you if you could just take a moment to shut your eyes and seat yourself comfortably and let me guide you through a little scene. And first, I want you to imagine yourself standing. I want you to sort of feel your feet solidly on the floor, maybe get a little bit of a sense of your physical orientation, where your arms are, and so on. And now I'm going to tell you something about the place where you are standing. There's going to be a couple of elements, and I want you to imagine them and place them in a scene wherever you want. The first is going to be a moderate stream of water flowing somewhere near you. You might want to note the direction it's flowing, the speed, the texture of the water. I also want you to imagine a forest, and you can imagine whatever style of forest you want, and you can place it wherever you want in relation to the stream and to yourself. And the third element is going to be a cliff. Where do you place the cliff? Now that all these elements are in place, I want you to imagine that you hear a voice. It's very indistinct, but it's human. Where is it coming from? And what do you want to do? What's your first response to it? I'm just going to give you a couple of seconds to play that out. Okay. We're not actually going to go any further with that experiment. I just wanted you to do enough to have something to think about as we go along. And when I give you some essentially archetypal elements, it seems to be pretty easy for most people to create a little human story, a little image around them. And you're probably not going to have too much trouble filling it with symbolism. You can think of the stream of life. You can think of the benign or the threatening atmosphere of the forest and the aspirational or terrifying heights of a cliff. So if we play a little bit in our minds with interpretation, let's say we take the cliff to mean being on a precipice of change. Are you at the top or at the bottom of the cliff? And what might either one of those things mean? And if a cliff represents a change that you're dealing with, the way that you picture the cliff in your mind, whether it is scalable or unscalable, can be related to how you address the effort that would be involved in facing this challenge. Is it something that you feel you can overcome, or is this something that you feel blocks you absolutely and consistently? And there's so much interpretive material in just this one element, and don't even get started on all the things that a forest could represent. And I didn't give you time to create a really idiosyncratic storyline, But if you did go further, like many maladaptive daydreamers do, most people's plot lines would be influenced by a collage of things which would naturally add up to something characteristic of them, even if it wasn't unique in all humanity. And this is because our images are always affected by our personal experience and therefore can have an individual metaphoric meaning. So let me give you an example from myself here. I grew up on the shore of the beautiful Bay of Fundy between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And clearly, one had to, it was a cliff lined coast, and clearly, one had to be careful about not walking too close to the edge of a cliff. But as a child, I was also afraid to walk too close to the bottom of the cliff because you could see that large pieces of rock had often fallen off of it. And then when you were on the shore, you could also hear little bits falling from above. And, you know, a small stone falling from 30 feet above your head could be very, very painful or dangerous. So for me, a cliff could also represent not just the danger of me falling, but the danger of something falling upon me from above. Metaphorically, for example, demands or disasters from family or institutions that might fall on me unexpectedly. And in fact, as a young adult, I often had a repetitious, anxious fantasy quasi dream of being pinned under a fallen rock while the tide came in inexorably. Again, very metaphoric. And because the situation in which I asked you to create this little fantasy was a public one, maybe you felt inclined to keep it very socially acceptable. But the fantasies that emerge when we're threatened, when we're traumatized, when we're sick, when we're grieving, they often come from a deeper and less socially filtered place. And if you felt certain that no one was going to hear your fantasy or judge it, maybe more unruly elements would come in: monsters, sex, greed, violence, even. And if I sent you home tonight with the assignment to connect your fantasy to your real life and how it reflected your typical responses or your habitual fears, it could be a surprisingly revealing exercise, even this simple fantasy, because willy nilly, our unconscious is always throwing up images that connect to our deeper needs and feelings. So, beginning in childhood, our fantasies are always colored by the challenges that life is presenting us. Child therapists know how meaningful and how revealing children's pretend games can be. Is the pretend parent generous and kind, or are they cruel and short-tempered? Does the child pretend to be a brave cowboy, or are they a little kitten that hides underneath the therapist's desk? We know that fantasy can be as soothing as it is entertaining. It's really amazing to be able to transport yourself in secret to a safe refuge. But psychological phenomena that can't be talked about, that grow untended in the shadows of our mental gardens, can grow wild. They creep out of their healthy borders. They can crowd out other healthy impulses until, as many daydreamers know to their cost, what was a harmless pleasure becomes a problematic and life-destroying addiction. But Jung intuitively understood from early on that people's fantasy life could serve their struggle for healing. And the reason, yes, and that's the reason why I think that Jung's perspective is relevant to our thoughts on maladaptive daydreaming. Now, just to summarize, Carl Jung was a Swiss psychologist who was working around the same time as Sigmund Freud. So that's the early 1900s. And like Freud, he also founded a school of depth psychology that's still very active today. And his interest in what he called peculiar states of mind was always strong and looked at from the modern perspective of what we know about maladaptive daydreaming. His psychiatry graduation thesis that he wrote in his mid 20s can be looked at as a thoughtful exploration about of the ability to be taken over by fantasy. And in it, he described his observations of the mediumistic performances of a 15-year-old girl he called by her initials SW. But what you ask is the connection between a medium and maladaptive daydreaming. Well, in that Victorian period, Jung and other psychologists were trying to understand the special abilities of the mind in states of hypnotic trance, the abilities that underpinned the so-called spirit communications that the mediums were channeling. And I think most of you are probably already familiar with the idea that when people are doing immersive daydreaming, they are entering a trance-like state. They're practicing a kind of self-hypnosis. Now, in his early paper, he quotes extensively from the work of one of his colleagues, Theodore Flournoy, who had published his own detailed observations of another young medium he called Miss Smith. And one of Miss Smith's talents was her ability to describe in vivid and convincing detail experiences from what she presumed were previous lives and ongoing interactions with people from places and times outside her real experience. Flournoy's book that was published in 1900 was called From India to the Planet Mars because one of Miss Smith's scenarios was a description of her previous life as the young bride of a 14th century Persian prince. And another elaborate storyline was set on the planet Mars. And in states of trance, Miss Smith acted out scenes of her conversations with the very human people of Mars and even spoke and wrote in their Martian language. And in his book, Flournoy argued that the Martian language she was speaking was just a glossolalia. Glossolalia is what we also call speaking in tongues. But Flournoy did believe that when Miss Smith felt that she was channeling past lives, she was actually telling out loud the what we would now call immersive fantasies that she was experiencing. Nevertheless, he found much to marvel at in her performance. And here are some of the things he said. He said, the unconscious possesses a marvelous ability for dramatization, personification, and psychological proliferation. It is endowed with a creative imagination. He was able to theorize the existence of a subliminal process capable of achieving a degree of complexity and extent comparable to the work of composition and reflection in the thinker or novelist. And concerning nighttime dreams, he said, by rising up from our hidden source, by throwing light on the intrinsic nature of our unconscious emotions, by revealing our ulterior motives and the instinctive slope of our associations of ideas, the dream is often an instructive probe into the unknown layers that support our ordinary personality. Now, these things could be written by a psychoanalyst today. And we have to remember that there wasn't any empirical research going on. There were no fMRI studies or anything like that. No one was trying to tease out the commonalities between various daydreamers. They were just doing their best to try to understand the place of dreams and fantasy in their patients' psychological ecology. Now, to go back to Jung, because of historical research into his biography, we now know that the young medium that Jung chose to study was actually his first cousin, Helene Pricework, a member of his mother's family. And Helen is described as being a teenager with no special talents. She preferred knitting or embroidery or just sitting around daydreaming. And we can also imagine that knitting and embroidery are tasks that permit also time and space for daydreaming. So this may be our first clue. At school, she was often considered absent-minded. And remember, this is before ADD. So again, there's a suspicion that she probably was capable of just going off into daydreams at school. But Jung said there was no psychological abnormality obvious in her childhood. And in his case study, he described Helen as being in her normal, non-trance state, just a girl of 15, no different from thousands of other girls. There was, however, a strong family history of having what Jung called waking hallucinations. So Helen's paternal grandfather had visions with whole dramatic scenes complete with dialogue. Again, what are we thinking here? Her father was apparently an odd, original personality who was prone to bizarre ideas, waking hallucinations, and second sight, and two of her paternal uncles were the same. Her mother was described as bordering on psychosis. So, to whatever degree there could be a familial susceptibility to this sort of experience, 15-year-old Helen was well placed to manifest them. And these people were Jung's relatives on his mother's side. Helen's father and Jung's mother were sister and brother. And this can be held in mind when we think about Jung's own capacity for the fantasies that later became so important to his theorizing. Now, in the Victorian period, when this story was taking place, seances were a popular social entertainment, and teenage Helen begged to be allowed to take part. So at first she did some seances in the family circle, but to general astonishment, it was discovered that she had the ability to fall into a trance. Now, Jung reports that Helen's own reaction to this development was to take it as perfectly natural, which is perhaps not so surprising considering the abilities of her other family members. Helen seemed fully convinced of the reality of her visions and happy to have found her true vocation as a medium. And why shouldn't she? She was suddenly getting the respect and admiration of her family and friends. And she had so much influence in her family, in fact, that three of her sisters also started having similar experiences. For them, it started with vivid dreams that gradually passed over into their waking hours. One sister in particular had dreams with storylines that developed from night to night until they also appeared when she was awake as vivid visions. So, again, like we're starting to see, things that very much resemble what we would now consider immersive or maladaptive daydreaming. So, knowing what we know today, we might have also wondered if Jung was really able to know whether these girls, who were dreaming these things when they were asleep, were actually asleep and actually dreaming, or whether they were lying in bed fantasizing, as many daydreamers do while their families think they are sleeping. So Helen was certainly part of a family who were psychologically predisposed to fantasy, hallucinations, and a very uncertain boundary between sleeping and waking states. So Jung attended Helen's seances for about 3 months, and he described how she'd become pale, she'd collapse in a chair, close her eyes, she'd be barely breathing, and she'd fall into a trance state, and she would start to speak. And gradually, she started to add gestures to her speeches, and she would stand up and act out whole dramatic scenes. So, again, here we're kind of thinking about, uh, you know, what we might see if we were watching an unobserved immersive daydreamer or daydream happening. Now, Jung never suggested that there was a supernatural element to this performance. But he noticed that while she was in trance, she exhibited a series of personalities. There were actually many personalities that came and went, but the most striking characters were the spirit of her dead grandfather, who was also Jung's grandfather, who appeared to her as a moral support and guide. Ivenes, who was a wise and virtuous older woman. And then towards the end of her mediumistic career, Ulrich von Gerbenstein, who was a sort of juvenile trickster figure. And Jung said that the stories that she told about these characters were romances swarming with open and secret love affairs, with illegitimate births and other sexual innuendos. And he could see the origins of these characters in her history. She'd been raised in a very religious household with a pastor father who gave moral sermons, and her deceased grandfather was respected and admired in the family as a spiritual authority. He felt that the virtuous character of Ivenis was her attempt at a middle ground, a kind of a more mature and ideal character that was somewhere between moralistic grandfather and juvenile Gerbenstein. And when Gerbenstein started to appear as a character, Jung said he was more or less a silly schoolgirl, even though he was male. So he was much more like Helen. And in that character, Jung saw the lively 15-year-old who sometimes went too far in her mischief. And it seems that when Gerbenstein appeared, her ordinary personality started to take over again, and the other unconscious personalities started to lose their punch. And Jung tracked the gradual decline of the seances from these lively personifications, as he called them, to increasingly conscious lying and fraud until she gave up the seances altogether. But Jung winds up observing that coming out of this process, Helen's character became pleasanter and more stable. So he speculated that the phenomena of double consciousness are simply new character formations or attempts of the future personality to break through. And he suggested that if there were psychological stressors, these emergent personalities could get tangled up with what he called peculiar states of consciousness. But later in life, so this would be probably more in his 50s, right? When he looked back on this experience, he said, in her trances, she had formulated for herself a very superior character, that of an older woman of great spiritual beauty. She herself, in reality, a very silly and superficial girl, could find no other way of expressing this unconscious urge within herself to be different, save through the spiritualistic setting and the acting out of the character she found there. He said she first worked up in the spiritual world what she wanted in reality, but then the spirit world had to decay before she could get rid of it. And he said the dishonesty of the girl had the ultimate result of breaking up the mediumistic seances, but then she was able to start to live out in reality the character she had developed for herself in the unconscious. And apparently, Helen grew up and moved to Paris, where she became a seamstress who was known for making beautiful clothes. But unfortunately, she died young at 26 of tuberculosis. And still later, in his 70s, Jung observed regretfully, had I known then what I know now, I could have understood the struggle she went through in order to express the best in her through this person of the trance. But as it was, I could only see her as a silly little girl who began to do something very ugly, namely to cheat for the sake of impressing me and others. Now, another important influence on his evolving ideas about the value of imaginative experiences came through his work on what are called the Miller fantasies. Miss Frank Miller was a young American woman who had been a patient of Flournoy's, and Flournoy had sent the fantasy material to Jung. She was a young American woman who was in her early 20s in 1906, and many of her fantasies revolved around her interests in pre-Columbian South American culture. But it seems that in Miss Miller's own understanding of her fantasies, she was a bit like Jung's cousin Helen. She took her ability for granted. She presumed that any sensitive person could fall into a self-hypnotic reverie like she could. And like Jung's cousin, she never asked whether there were any deeper psychological meanings being played out in her fantasies. She wasn't ever Jung's patient. As I said, he received her material from Flournoy, but Jung was fascinated. He identified with the experiences that she was going through, and he spent a lot of time um, diving into amplifying and interpreting the fantasies. In Jungian terms, amplifying means relating them to mythology, fairy tales, and other kind of archetypal material. Now, as I said, Again, looking back in life, later in life, Jung felt that Miss Miller's fantasies had also been her way of clinging to a childlike world. So, like it's in a sense the opposite of Helen's. She was clinging to a childlike world and hanging back from the challenges of adult life. And he saw her Aztec fantasy hero as a potential kind of spirit guide to take her through this difficult passage. He saw it as a failed unconscious attempt at psychological development. It failed because, without understanding the symbolic meaning and intention of her fantasies, Miss Miller couldn't incorporate the values of the hero archetype into her conscious personality and progress further. And Jung felt that it would have been the proper role of an analyst to help a patient like her to interpret and integrate these fantasies. And unfortunately, Miss Miller was put in a psychiatric hospital by the time she was 30. So it was too bad. Now, some of you may know that when Jung was in his early 30s, he met Sigmund Freud, and they began their very famous and passionate psychoanalytic collaboration. But when their relationship went awry after 7 years, and for many reasons, the breakup was literally traumatic and emotionally disorienting for both of them. And for a long time, it seems, Jung was unable to snap himself out of his depression about it. But the following year, after he had a series of frightening dreams that he felt were sort of prophetic of the World War coming, which it was, he decided to submit himself to what he called the impulses of the unconscious. So every evening after supper, he went down to his study and he let his fantasies take over, trying humbly to follow them in whatever direction they went. He wrote them down as well as he could, and he made an effort to analyze them. And he was spending a lot of time with these fantasies. He eventually sort of like wrote them out beautifully in calligraphy. He did paintings to illustrate them and so on. Like he spent a lot of time with the fantasies. And diving into his inner life like this, he did worry about becoming a victim of his fantasies because he had seen this happen. So he guarded his mental stability consciously by staying attached to his family and professional life. And he oriented himself as well to his scientific curiosity to prevent himself from being completely taken over. He stayed very clear in his mind that what he was experiencing was an attempt to understand his psychological states, and he hoped that the experience would teach him something that would be helpful to his own patients. Now, I'm not going to go into the content of his fantasies here because they were long and complex. And if you're not familiar with the work of Jung, pretty confusing. But like Helen, there were some centrally important characters that he interacted with. He had encounters with Siegfried, the hero, Philomen, who represented superior insight, and Salome, who was an erotic element, very much, an instinctual kind of character, what he called an anima figure. And he spent years afterwards working out the meaning and purpose of the conversations that he'd had with these imaginary but seemingly autonomous inner characters. And he describes how the more he found the images that were concealed in the emotions, the more calm and stable he felt. So this is, one of the images that he painted of Philemon to go along with the calligraphic version of the book. So Jung's personal experiments with what he called active imagination had made him feel that spontaneous fantasies were a better pathway to psychological understanding even than dreams, because being closer to consciousness, fantasies already had a more coherent character. But he noticed that only some of his patients could fall into fantasy mode at any time. So he described it as a none too common talent. And now we know that the prevalence of this is something around 2.5% in the population. So he was seeing that not everyone found it as easy to fantasize with the same kind of vividness and complexity, but he wondered if the ability to produce fantasies could be developed with practice in other people. Now, as a psychiatrist, um, Jung had often seen patients who turned inwards into fantasy in ways that derailed them psychologically, what he called compulsive forms of imagining that became harmful. Where have we heard about this before? Quite probably what we would now identify as maladaptive daydreaming. So he distinguished between what he called creative and regressive imagination. Losing yourself in the kind of imagination that was only for escape or wish fulfillment was regressive. And he contrasted this to what he called creative imagination, where the conscious ego remained present to interact with the imagined characters, because he felt this created the possibility of connecting inner and outer reality through what he was calling active imagination. Active imagination was the technique that Jung proposed to create self-understanding through interactions with personified aspects of the personality, which would be made available for conversation in fantasies. And this is because fantasy characters are often animated by less consciously understood feelings and impulses. So Jung felt that our inner characters could introduce feelings and understandings that the conscious ego avoided or even rejected, because they could personify and dramatize our rejected qualities, our unexplored talents, our opposite sex qualities, and even our human universals. So he placed a high value on fantasy, and he saw it as part of the unconscious system that works to compensate and balance the often painful and biased situation of consciousness. Now, most of you have heard the aphorism, a dream not interpreted is like a letter unread. I mean, we can apply this to immersive daydreaming too. Immersive daydreaming is vivid and engaging, and it can be used as a defense and a distraction from the difficulties of life. But that doesn't mean that it improves psychological development automatically. Maladaptive daydreaming or immersive daydreaming naturally and intuitively creates characters and illustrates dynamic relationships, but it differs fundamentally from Jungian active imagination, because in immersive and maladaptive daydreaming, there's usually no attempt to understand the experience for the purposes of growth and individuation. Jungian analyst Murray Stein argues that we should try to make efforts to develop our capacity to reflect on our fantasies. All of us, not just immersive and maladaptive daydreamers. So, he elaborates on, how to do an active imagination, and he describes it as having three basic steps. First, you have to align yourself towards it. You have to let go and empty your mind, relax, take deep breaths. It's basically a typical meditation or relaxation preparation, right? And then second, you open your mind to receive whatever comes. That's the Jungian wording of it. But if nothing comes spontaneously, a person might choose an emotionally charged image from a fantasy or a dream as a starting point, and then allow the fantasy to develop from there. Now, for non-maladaptive or non-immersive daydreamers, entering a state of active imagination is often difficult, because their conscious mind keeps trying to take over and rejects the fantasy as silly or grandiose. On the other side, unfortunately, because most immersive and maladaptive daydreaming starts young, when there isn't much sophisticated self-reflective ability available, Many people who have this natural gift for fantasy may stay stuck in what Jung called the regressive track and never think about working with their fantasies psychologically. Now, Stein's and Jung's third rule of active imagination is to engage with the character or the situation that is presented by the fantasy, uh, from the reality of the conscious self, not as the character in the story, not as some ideal personality, because that's the moment to let that pesky conscious mind participate with all its objections and all of its biases, because it's only if the experience of connection to this inner character or this inner situation can persuade consciousness of something despite its fears and prejudices, that psychological headway can be made, and the ego can carry that development back out into real life in a healing way. So here, like, just to do a little promo, I think that we should get Kyla Borchard to come in one day and talk about this, because her ideas about free characters and connected daydreaming are very much in this vein. Now, also, because the deep waters of the psyche can raise questions that are outright destabilizing to the ego, inner work that reaches the depth of an active imagination often needs support from someone else to integrate the insights. So, in a Jungian treatment, a proper Jungian analysis, active imagination is actually only usually encouraged later in therapy, when the analysand has emotionally stabilized and the therapeutic relationship is secure, so that there is a safe container to bring this material into. And, compare this thoughtful approach to the free-for-all of a naive daydreamer's experience. Jung also knew that relatively few people were willing to make the enormous effort that he made to interpret his fantasies, and he felt he knew why. He recognized that even people with a good, strong ego prefer to avoid insights that would require them to make disruptive changes in their life. So another Jungian writer, Marie-Louise von Franz, pointed out that Jung also proposed a fourth rule for active imagination, and that is that we have to allow it to affect us. Jung said, "The images of the unconscious place a great responsibility upon a man. Failure to understand them, or a shirking of ethical responsibility, deprive him of his wholeness and imposes a painful fragmentariness on his life." Jung proposed a process of maturing the ego and creating a relationship between the surface and the depth of the personality. And he felt that this was a lifelong process of development that he called individuation. So, what should we be aiming at in our understanding of dreams and fantasies? Well, ultimately, in the individuation process, we come to understand how many inner forces are actually at work in us and how little power our conscious ego often has. And hopefully, we develop some respect for these internal powers, and we start to trust rather than fight the good guidance that can come from our inner resources. So here's a last quote from Jung. He said, "If we do not allow the active imagination to change us, we have failed to take it seriously at all." As Jung pointed out, the ethical obligations for personal change and responsibility that deep psychological work imposes can be addressed through working with our dreams and our fantasies. But this often requires humility and sustained effort rather than the heroic grandiosity and pleasurable experiences that most people would prefer to fantasize about. So the challenge for dreamers and daydreamers and those who wish to understand them is always how to find the curiosity and the courage to do that work. Thank you. That's the end of my part.
That was amazing. Thank you for putting that together. So fascinating that People were talking about this so long ago.
I think people have been talking about it basically forever.
Incredible. And all this time, I spent searching, trying to find any discussion about after daydreaming in current literature 20 years ago. And this had been going on for so long.
Yeah, but you had to know what the keyword for the search was. That's the problem,
That
right?
was,
That
yeah,
there was no keyword for it. And so people have been talking, there's also a Jerome Singer in the 1970s wrote a book on daydreaming in which he described his own experience. I think he had a character, a baseball player named Poppy Ort, who was his character that he started as a teenager and maintained into his adult research life. So this is something that has been going on. It just was so it took Dr. Summer and his crew and all of the volunteers and the other people that got involved to kind of to tease out the specific experiences that all together created what we call like a syndrome, right? A whole group of things coming together in a kind of reliable way that you could give a name to.
I'd love to hear other people's comments. I did find Dr. Singer's work. I didn't find the earlier work, but I remember then the feeling was there was a singer and there was a clinger. The feeling then was that it was creative and good and not really, it couldn't really be maladaptive. But I did find that.
I think
But
we'd have to do a close reading. I'd have to read the book again very closely to see to what degree he ever argued that there could have been a problematic aspect to this. How
yeah,
to fall asleep without daydreaming. How it sometimes takes hours while this is Frushti. Um, uh, actually, I don't have the answer to that. This is something that Jung didn't have an answer to either, or Freud. None of them had an answer to how to help people stop, this their kind of addictive behavior when they have this capacity. So this is the work of the modern research, I think, to try and figure out what the pathway is to that. I mean, people like Jung and Freud were mainly thinking about it in a psychoanalytic way, how the what the images might have to say to the individual. I mean, this is I think that the psychoanalytic point of view probably has something to offer to the treatment side for those people that want to approach their daydreams in that way. And maybe it would be, finding a better use for them, or a, what's the word I'm looking for, a righteous use for them, um, would maybe make them less pressing without taking them away entirely.
do you think it's important to understand what like the underlying need is that they're fulfilling in order to stop it? Do you have to do that work to,
Again, this is all new stuff. All we can do with by bringing the psychoanalytic things into it, and Richard Sheffitz too is Sheffitz is maybe is how you pronounce his name, is also kind of working at it sort of empirically from a psychodynamic point of view, interpreting things. Yeah, somebody said that they're afraid to tell their therapist about it because the therapists haven't heard of it. Well, that's because the research is really new. If you think of anybody who was trained, in the last 10 or 15 years, this is not in any textbook. This is not in the DSM, though there is a push now to get it put into the DSM. And if it is put into the DSM, therapists are just going to have to flip through their DSM and they're going to see it there, right? So this is very important to get it into the DSM. This is the diagnostic manual of mental illness. Um, but at the moment, unless the therapist has stumbled over it, or unless the patient brings the therapist to the site and says, look at this, right? There's no particular reason. And yet, every time I've spoken to therapists about this, there's always been a couple that say, oh, yes, I've had a patient like this, right? But for most therapists, again, because the patients don't tell them they're doing it, or rarely tell them they're doing it, for most therapists, they'll have a couple people that will talk about it. And for them, they're just one-offs, right? Oh, this is a person. They have this peculiar capacity and they have no sense of the bigger picture.
There's quite a few questions in the
Yeah.
chat.
Let me see the chat here.
One of the, if it's easier, I can read you. One of the, if I go to earlier, I might be saying this name incorrectly, Shushti,
Yeah.
mentioned that she never imagines about things going on in life. Some of the characters are mostly, you've never seen them anywhere. I mean, I find that to be true for mine as well, but I still think the characters might, some of the problems that you have in real life, sometimes people give those to their characters. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that comment?
Well, yeah, I think that the unconscious doesn't necessarily show you things directly. These are personifications. A personification is taking a quality or a problem or something and turning it into a character, right? That's what personifying something is. So no, it doesn't have to. Some people do have daydreams about real people, especially people who are limerent, for example, will have very elaborate daydreams about somebody, a person, a particular person who is a real person. Um, but like, just think about this, for example. I mean, the old, if there's any of you old enough to have seen the original Star Trek series, the four characters, Spock and Captain Kirk and McCoy and who was the other one? The engineer. Anyway, like they encapsulate certain kind of character qualities, right? Spock is very much the rational thinker, right? And so, your mind, when they want to represent, I mean, I don't know about everybody's mind, but certainly for some people, the mind will draw on qualities of character that illustrate a certain kind of mindset, you know? I mean, I don't know how many people would fantasize about, um, you know, um, a stepmother who's beautiful or something, rather than, a stepmother who's a wicked stepmother and make her beautiful. Their mind is gonna, make her ugly or fat somehow to kind of pull her, unless the problem is that the stepmother is beautiful, and that's part of the problem.
I mean, I've seen it work both ways, where you can make your characters be wish fulfillment, some of the things that you don't
Yeah.
have. But I also was talking to someone recently who, when she got a diagnosis of something, gave one of her characters the same diagnosis. And
Yes.
characters are completely different people, made up people, but they do sometimes work through some of the problems that you have in real life.
Yeah.
Right.
It's a way of experiencing. I mean, essentially, I mean, we have imagination. We've evolved imagination so that we can kind of predictively experience something without having to actually put ourselves in danger for it. We can imagine what's going to happen if we do this or we do that.
So there's about four more questions in the chat. This one I know the answer to, but
Well,
obviously
which
it's
one, which question and
it
why
is
don't you?
always, is it always bad or maladaptive? I'm a creative person and find it a useful tendency to build my creative life.
Well, you find it useful. I think quite a few people, I know quite a few people who are immersive daydreamers who use it creatively, but they're not usually the ones that are tormented by it and can't control it and, are losing sleep and not getting to work or to class, right? Because again, it's somehow a capacity then that's integrated into the needs of daily life. I mean, T. Lee, do you want to speak up? I mean, do you find that the daydreaming is getting in the way, or is it purely helpful?
And it's okay if you don't feel comfortable,
It's
Okay.
okay.
but
It's okay. I don't mind. I'm just a bit shy, but because I don't really talk about it beyond. But I'm a writer, so my it's almost since I can remember. It's like I create characters, and I don't write about those characters. They're like a whole different thing, and I do recognize that I'm working through stuff, and that I had quite a bit of trauma in my childhood, and I do know that I'm creating a an idealistic life. It's not. I don't, but I know I recognize the tendencies. I know that the things I'm creating are, idealizations of, uh, of what I would like. Where I think it stops is like, rather than attempt to get those things, I can just go there. So when I have a stressful situation, I'll pop in, and that will be the thing I can control. And I
Mhm.
really do think it has a lot to do with my, because I've had a lot of therapy, and I've had to explain this thing when I have told people. I haven't really. I've told one counselor. She didn't know how to help me. The problem is they don't know how to help you, so you don't bother telling anybody. Because like all they're going to do is just say, well, you stop it, and it's like, well, no, it's like, for me, it would be like abandoning 20 years of a relationship. So I do find it helpful in some ways just to calm me down. It's either that or I play backgammon to stop my brain because I have anxiety. So it's one or the other, and which one's better? I mean, people who play video games as an addiction, they're just, or they, or people who are live their life through Second Life. I never played that. I never played that video game, but because of it, I didn't need to. I had one. So that's the sort of thing. It's not like I would rather stay in bed and not go to work. I live like a functioning life, but I have this thing.
What I think, and um, an engagement in a kind of a more depth psychological way with the characters and so on would be to create an enrichment of the experience where it would go from being just an escape and an entertainment to part of the process of psychological and emotional growth rather than just a way of dealing with unpleasantness. And here I think we should get Kyla Borchard in because she had some very interesting ideas on how to, and I'm not going to steal her thunder by explaining it, because I hope they will get her. But I think that exploring dreams and fantasies for meaning gives them dignity.
yeah, I will email Kyla and ask if she'll do an upcoming webinar. But I also want to say that I have been talking to two successful television writers
Yeah.
who, when I told them about my maladaptive daydreaming, both of their jaws dropped, saying that they daydreamed throughout their entire childhood and thought
Oh,
there was
yeah.
something wrong with them. And now they're like, that's how we make all our money and think it's great. So I think that's the definition of the difference between immersive and maladaptive daydreaming. I think some of us are born and I think Dr. Sommer would agree. Some of us were born with this ability to create these
Yeah.
wonderful imaginary fantasy worlds. And then, depending on life circumstances, whether it's trauma or comorbid conditions, anxiety, OCD, it can turn maladaptive. But the ability to use this imagination is a good thing if you can get it under control. Right? Does that seem right to you? Susan, would you,
Yeah.
would you use
Yeah,
that?
no, I agree with that. And I was just looking at somebody who was asking Samsung SM, whoever this is, who was asking about Tolkien's work. I mean, Tolkien, for sure, he was an immersive daydreamer, and also the guy who wrote The Wizard of Oz and Alice in Wonderland. I mean, it's like if you read their biographies, you'll see. I mean, there will be references to their elaborate fantasy life. And somebody else asked um uh whether family history is a factor. And I think that's an interesting question. I don't think the research has addressed it yet. But if you go to what I was talking about Carl Jung, how so many people on one side of his family had this capacity for like waving back and forth across the line between fantasy and reality, what they were calling visions, what they were calling second sight, all of these things. I think a lot of these other lucid dreaming and so on, I think a lot of that stuff is probably a cousin of maladaptive daydreaming. In fact, I would like one day to do a presentation on what I call the close cousins to maladaptive daydreaming because there's some very interesting ones. Um, and again, for the writers, many writers that I have worked with as a therapist have said, oh yes, either in their childhood or still, that they worked a lot in their imaginations and that they worked out stories in their imagination and that they felt that their characters were felt autonomous, like the characters were talking to them and they were just writing out what the characters said, right? And this is called the illusion of something agency, autonomous agency, or something like that. And Sigmund Freud wrote about that in Creative Writers, right? But when I work with creative writers who, people who are trying to write their daydreams, um, I'm a little hesitant to get too analytic about the content of the storyline if they're trying to write it down as a novel or something, because I think that for it to really flow, it has to just be allowed to do it, right? The story has to just be allowed. If you get too analytic, it's like trying to think about how you ride a bike as opposed to just doing it. So, if people want to talk about it a little bit, I will. But if it's not interfering with their life in some other way, I say just let it go, right? And then I also had a writer that I saw briefly who was a very prolific writer in the real world. And she told me that she created her books through basically this kind of imagination. And I asked her, did she ever just do it for herself for fun? And she looked at me completely taken aback and she says, oh no, that would be disgusting. She literally said that would be disgusting, you know? So like she very much saw it as a tool. So what else have we got here for questions? Yes, you wish the character's qualities should be inside you. And they are. They are. Maybe not to the exaggerated level that you can carry them in fantasy, but your characters have got ordinary human qualities, generosity, physical strength, uh, artistic talent, and we can all, if we really want to, nurture and develop those capacities in ourselves, right? They may never be at this exotic level of the character, but it doesn't need to be in order to be satisfying. Oh, this is Kayla. She says she'd be happy to do a webinar. Look, we're arranging this in real time.
Kayla, I'll email you and get some dates. Kyla.
Yeah, and T. Lee said that she doesn't write her beloved imagined characters. She uses other characters that she's less attached to. Yeah.
Someone asked if maladaptive daydreaming could be a coping mechanism from a bad childhood.
Well, we know perfectly well that that's true, right? That's like rule number one.
Yes.
No, it doesn't always have to be a bad childhood. If you have a strong capacity for it, you're just going to do it, right? If you're a hyper visualizer.
Yeah, I think Dr. Sommer's initial theory was it was a direct result of childhood abuse and trauma. But then what happened is people came forward saying they didn't have that degree of childhood abuse and trauma and still had maladaptive daydreaming. So it's a very common pathway, but it is not the only pathway.
Yeah, and other people who have had a lot of abuse, and then this is the lighter version. They dissociate. They just kind of fuzz out the world, right? They don't have enough imaginary capacity to turn it into another world, but they just kind of like zone out. Or they turn to other ways of soothing themselves, like drinking or drugs or sex or whatever. I think we're going to have a problem though with the AI, right? Because people who don't have the capacity for immersive daydreaming can now have the job done for them by AI. AI will create the character that will interact with them, but it's not going to be the same thing because it's not all made up from your parts, right? But there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be addicted, I think, to AI daydreaming. Yeah,
100%. Or just
PhDs. And
AI
then
in
and
general.
then and then people are going to start knowing about maladaptive daydreaming, right?
That's,
If we can make the link to AI addiction, AI story addiction. You mentioned some site parallel life or something, which I don't, a game,
I mean,
second
that,
second
that
life, which I
I,
don't know about, but it's probably going to be things like that.
yeah, we wanted to do, if anyone wants to email me, I wanted to do a webinar on AI and maladaptive daydreaming because I've been hearing that people have used AI to facilitate their daydreaming, and I didn't understand how that worked, but I tried it and it is pretty addictive, right? Like you give it prompts and it writes your daydream for you. It's a lot less effort. So I would love to do a webinar on that. So if anyone has experience with that, I'm going to put my contact information in the chat.
Yeah.
Um, Another question. So dissociative behavior can become MD, or is MD and this dissociative behavior?
Well,
It,
I think when they're planning to put it in the DSM, they're planning to put it in as a kind of dissociative disorder. That's the category that it's going to be put in. And dissociative just, in this case means you detach yourself from ordinary reality. Trance states are also dissociative.
yeah. And I do think back to the AI for a second. I think that AI in the daydreaming is a problem, but I also think that the what we thought were rare cases of one or two people like falling in love with their I think that's going to be much more common. Like the language that it uses is very grooming language, and I think if there's any
That's
vulnerability there,
interesting. Grooming
I
language.
mean, well, I come from the human trafficking field, and I'm noticing like the way it encourages you, the way it seems very familiar to me. And I think if
Yeah.
there's any vulnerability there,
Mhm.
I think it's going to be very common.
And as it gets better and better, it's going to be harder and harder to tell it from the real thing.
Yeah. Question on there's some questions about dissociation in the chat. Does dissociative mean you're unaware of surroundings? What if you're
Um,
aware but
not
not focused?
often, not completely, but it's like there's a barrier to your emotional response to the feeling, right? Somebody might be standing and raging at you, and it's like there's a glass wall or something between you and them, right? You've dissociated in that case from your feeling reactions. You can dissociate from your body, then people have out of body responses, right? Or a lot of people dissociate from their feelings because their feelings are too hard, but people can also dissociate from their real life perceptions too and go into a fantasy.
Two more questions just came up from Kyla.
Yeah.
We have, is immersive daydreaming also dissociative?
Yeah, sure it is. Because you're just unhooking yourself from ordinary reality. But that doesn't mean dissociating doesn't necessarily mean it's not absolutely a bad thing. We have a capacity to dissociate. Pretty much all human beings do, right? Especially in traumatic situations.
And then the last one I definitely relate to. Sometimes even in my happy moments, I have an urge to daydream. And if I don't, it makes me frustrated. And I definitely relate to that because when I was younger, I thought the daydreaming would stop once I became happy. But I remember periods of my life where I was completely happy. And then I just felt the need to incorporate that happiness into my daydreams.
Yeah.
It didn't go away. So I don't know,
People
any
who
thoughts
people
on
who
that?
use people who use alcohol to numb themselves also use alcohol in hap on happy occasions, you know, if you've got the capacity. And in your case, you're saying you could incorporate the happiness into the fantasy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I mean, it's a fascinating ability. Gosh knows. More
And,
therapists should know about it.
and so that's where we get to like, I mean, a lot of Kyla's work, which I was extremely impressed with, is that we need to find something that replaces our daydreaming. But I also wonder if you need some psychoanalytical perspective as to what the daydreams mean to you, because I found things to replace my daydreaming and it still didn't go away.
Does it need to go away, or does it just need to be not destructive?
Yeah.
I had one patient who said, I can come home and I can sit down and watch a couple TV shows, or I can just sit on the sofa and daydream, right? I go, like, why not? What's the difference,
Right.
right?
Yeah. So it's not about getting rid of it, it's about getting it under control.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? And feel free to come. I mean, if anyone wants to come off mic or, I mean, not just put it in the chat, but say something. Yeah, someone wrote the difference is you can turn the TV off versus you can't turn your mind off.
Well, except that you will turn your mind off the instant somebody taps you on the shoulder and asks you something, you know? Like you're not walking into walls when you're, walking down the street daydreaming. Somebody stops you, because you're not psychotic. A psychotic person can't get out of their hallucination, right? But a daydreamer can get out of it instantly, anytime. What they can't do, what they seem, because I'm not one myself, what it seems is you can't prevent yourself from getting into one
And wanting to go back
and wanting to stay.
and wanting to stay
Yeah.
is, I mean, I found that with the AI, other people have not. Other people have said the AI has made it much worse. But I find that it's easier for me to let the computer do one of my daydreams because then I can just shut the computer off as opposed to when I'm doing it myself. It's like I have to do it 100 times and get it right. But everybody's,
See, I mean, that's a whole other thing, the business, the get it, do it 100 times and get it right. It's like, I mean, there's so many species of daydreaming actually, that I don't know. Again, there's still more research to be done. Is there a difference between the get it right kind of daydreaming and the it just flows on forever
yeah,
daydreaming?
yeah. And I think that depends on comorbidities. Like my comorbidity was OCD, so it just got frustrating doing it over and over. Um, Someone wrote, sometimes daydreaming is fun, but sometimes I make myself mad sad. So it's not much stopping, not starting. It's a matter of what I focus on. Yeah, I think we all make ourselves mad and sad. There.
I used it for when I couldn't properly grieve a lot. So you were able to grieve, to cry, to be upset in the fantasy, but not in real life. Yes. Yeah, yeah. Again, because you were dissociated from your feelings in real life, probably. But you could express them in fantasy because it's so private.
Lost on the regular road, but still I reach safely. Is that good or bad? I'm not, I think I would need more of a description what that means. It's one of the comments. Lost- Good or bad? Um, okay. Like while traveling to school, she daydreams, but you still get there safely. I think, okay, that's what she means.
Okay. Well, there's an awful lot of people driving on the highway having arguments in their head with, uh, you know, a colleague, a friend, a parent, right? Having an elaborate, and sometimes it goes over and to the your thing, Jane, about repeating it till you get it right, right? There's a lot of people that will go in, they'll try to rewrite a conversation, right? And they'll go over and over it again, trying to find the right thing to have said in order to really have the punch and so on. So again, this is something that kind of like, you know, spreads out into ordinary daydreaming as well.
And for a lot of the questions on whether it's good or bad, I think it really only the person can tell. It becomes, I don't even like the word bad, but problematic is if it's starting to interfere with your real life.
Yeah.
But if you can do it right, the example that you gave, Susan, of someone just, doing it an hour or two a night. I mean, I have a family member who spends 1 hour a night when other people are watching TV, just pacing,
Yeah.
imagining, right?
Yeah.
But he can shut it off after that hour.
Yeah. There's lots of kids with their screens that also their parents want them to be able to shut it off after an hour and they can't. You know, shutting off something pleasurably stimulating is tough. And also another area where I think that therapists need to be informed is exactly in the question of comorbidities. Like there seems to be a larger percentage of people on the spectrum who are daydreamers. So if you're working with people on the spectrum, you should know about maladaptive daydreaming. So if you see somebody pacing, right? If your kid is pacing and gesturing and mumbling, you aren't, you don't think that they're necessarily psychotic. Or, if there's OCD involved and they're just, compulsively replaying a conversation or something that they had, then, there's help is needed there too.
Yeah, and I think it's very common on the spectrum, and yet I think a lot of people who work with people on the spectrum don't know about it. I think people are still stuck on people on the spectrum are not imaginative, and that's not
Yeah,
true at all.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So, um, Ingela Visuri had the wonderful paper on autism and imaginary characters, and that it's so much easier for someone who has social communication difficulties to interact with an imaginary character, because the imaginary character will always know exactly what you mean. You will always know what the character really wants or intends. Why? Because of course they're out of your imagination. So you can mumble something, part words, whatever, and the character will understand you fully, right? So that's very appealing to people that struggle to find ways to relate to people. But
Maria,
let's
thank you for there's a good idea in the chat. And two more questions, Susan, if you have time. We're running out of time, but if you have
Yeah,
time, there's two more questions in the chat
sure.
from Nick and Shrishti.
Watching lectures. That do you have a problem watching social media while you're supposed to be at lectures? Well, start taking notes. Don't don't have your phone on. Um, but I mean, is your addiction then to social media as opposed to daydreaming?
It's I think Susan, exactly what you're saying is find something else. Like if you notice, I talk a lot in meeting. Part of this is I'm facilitating, but I found that if I say nothing in meetings, like I tend to zone out. So like I force myself to participate, I force myself to take notes. Like if you give yourself a task to do, you're more likely to pay attention. And then Nick had something too. Do you want me to read that one to you? Sometimes I use my daydreams to feel my emotions more as in real life. In real life, I can't really feel the
Yeah.
emotions. It's just bland, but it makes me even more confused if the emotion I'm daydreaming is real or not.
Well, the emotions in daydreaming are real. The emotions are real. The characters aren't necessarily, but the feelings are definitely real. We can make ourselves have feelings. We can get feelings from watching TV shows. Happy, sad, things make us laugh, things make us cry. We feel these things in our body for sure. Um, but I think, this is another area that could probably stand some research is when people are dissociated from their emotions in real life, do they compensate for, by putting those emotions into fantasy stories? And I asked a patient once who said she was telling me something that to me sounded quite quite troublesome, like should be upset about it. And she's talking about it in this very, very calm voice. And I said to her, like, you don't sound like you're very upset about that. And she's going, no, I don't feel very much about things. I said, but what's going on in your fantasy world? And she says, big, big feelings, right? The story like takes off into some sort of a drama, not copying the problem in real life, but the emotions that you can't experience in real life are being experienced in another story in the fantasy.
And in some ways, that's a healthy, right? Would you say? I mean, I wouldn't. Would you call that a healthy
Well, I mean,
opening?
no, I don't think it's all that healthy. I think that, you should be experiencing your emotions in your body in real life. You should be angry at the people that you're angry at and love the people that you should be loving or want to love, right? And not have that all dim, dim, dim in reality and all bright and sparkly in fantasy. Um, there's a couple things. Yes, please send Jane the contact information for Autistic Adults NYC. I might like to have an excuse to go down to New York. And somebody asked whether medications like Ritalin have an effect on maladaptive daydreaming. One of the very first research articles from Dr. Zummer, you may remember, Jane, was the case of Ben, basically client 001. And they gave him Ritalin. And yes, it did improve his focus in his classwork, but it doubled his daydreaming. So they had to stop it, right? Because Ritalin increases focus. And for the daydreaming, you need to block out all the exterior stimulation and you have to be able to focus inward on the daydream. And the Ritalin helps that too, right? But, in this, so that wasn't particularly helpful. They're not, the whole question of medication for MD is still being worked out by the researchers.
Yeah, anecdotally, I've heard it works for some people and not for others, and different ones work for different people,
Yeah.
depending on your comorbidity.
The screen. Yes. Your mind says, Maria says that her daydreams come up like a screensaver when the computer isn't being used. So your mind doesn't like being, well, you know what, but this is actually true for non-maladaptive daydreamers though, but that's people doing ordinary daydreaming, which is just sort of very brief in and out of thoughts, imaginary conversations, a memory about something, and they just kind of like flash up, right? And if somebody pokes you on the shoulder, you probably won't even remember what kind of stuff you've been thinking about. But our minds are never actually blank, except maybe when we're sleeping. Even not even and daydreamers, it's coherent. It's a specific story, as opposed to mind wandering, which is what the rest of it's called. Invested in a story that under the two realities. Well, we have a capacity to invest in characters, don't we?
Yeah.
I was very fond of Tarzan when I was 12.
I mean,
He was my hero. I read all the books.
and
No,
back to the social media, I think the comment out says, I mean, watching social media, you can zone out. I mean, social media can be a trigger for the daydreaming. And I mean, watching social media is not that productive to begin with. So I think, does it matter whether you're daydreaming or watching social media? The trick is to try to keep, when you don't want to daydream, to try to keep your brain engaged on active things. Watching social media is pretty passive and is a trigger, a known trigger for
yeah.
daydreaming. I'm trying to see if we missed any major questions. I think that's it.
Yeah.
Susan, this was absolutely wonderful. It was fascinating.
Thank you.
And thank you for doing all that work to tape it in advance. Much appreciated. And you can see by the chat how engaged everybody was and how exciting this was. So thank you very much. People, please check out the ISMD. We could use volunteers, send us ideas, webinar ideas. And we're going to do another webinar in May with some exercises with Dr. Ramiro Catalan, who's going to do some exercises to help us with our maladaptive daydreaming and to be more compassionate with ourselves and our daydreaming. And then we're also going to set up one with Kyla
Yeah.
that we just did in real time.
And I'll do one, if you will take me, on the close cousins of maladaptive daydreaming.
Absolutely, anytime. This was really wonderful. So thank you
Bye-bye,
so
everybody.
much. Bye,
Thank you
everybody.
for tuning in.
Thank you.